even that time, even the warlord government in China, because China also had its own revolution in 1911. The thousand-year-old monarchy was overthrown, and China became a republic. But it's a republic in name only, because pretty soon China basically fell into what's today known as a warlord period, where different warlord carved up a different province in China. But there's a nominal government in Beijing, and this warlord government in Beijing was convinced by the Allied powers to join World War One, and then by providing Chinese labor, and so about 250,000 Chinese men were sent to the Western Front in Europe. They were supposed to work in factories, so allow the European men to go fight. But a lot of the cases, these Chinese men were also sent to do very dangerous job of digging trenches and dragging out bodies and taking the wounded from the fire line. But in Russia, a similar number also went to Russia. They went to build railroad, to man factories. In fact, during World War One, they had to the Allies, because the Russia was cut off by Ottoman Turkey, from breaking out the Black Sea. So they decided to open a new supply route to Russia through the Arctic at the port of Murmansk. And Russia said to build a railroad connecting Murmansk in the Arctic to St. Petersburg. And out of the 60,000 labor committed to build this railroad to the Arctic, 10,000 were Chinese. So at that time, there were a lot of Chinese men working in Russia, and many of them got caught up in this Russian Civil War and the revolution. And many of them, because out of necessity, they joined the Bolshevik side, because the white side didn't like them very much. And the white side didn't like, they were pretty racist toward Chinese.
Well, they also, the White Army had a lot of factional infighting. They had their own warlords in the Far East. So that's a whole nother story. But I think we can mention this, officially it's known as the 1918 intervention. I mean, it's an outright invasion by multiple European countries. Obviously, at the forefront, you had Britain and France, the United States, and of course, Japan. So the regions impacted were the Far East, but for the US and Japan, also the Northwest for the European powers. And then, of course, the European powers were also very interested in A, the Caucasus, B, what was Ukraine or present-day Ukraine, and basically the southern Russia. So those were the three focal points for this so-called intervention. Now, officially, and of course, you had sort of breakaway things like the Czech Legion that was initially part of the World War I effort until the 1917 Russian Revolution. Yeah. And so officially they were fighting against the Bolsheviks, but of course, in reality, they were basically looting. So you talked about the furs in the Far East, right? That logging and fur industries and mining, right? Those were the main industries there. So they were basically taking anything they could. And they were not really very nice to the local population that really wasn't supporting either side. In fact, they turned the local population in some places towards the Bolsheviks because they would just get brutally beaten and shot. I have a video on my channel about this topic. I had to read some documents, and I was kind of shocked that I didn't really learn much about this, and discovering this as an adult was really shocking, because you kind of usually read about this nice little adventure for these powers that came to fight the Bolsheviks. But, in reality, when you hear modern calls to dismember Russia, you really think back to, oh, well, this was definitely what they were trying to do at that time, but they were not successful. One of the main reasons was, for instance, there was a mutiny in Odessa on the Black Sea for the French, because they were just exhausted from fighting in World War I, and here they are being sent to invade, the collapsing Russian Empire and sort of engage in military adventurism, quote unquote, there. So eventually they kind of had to pull out, and obviously the Bolsheviks, against all odds, were eventually successful in reconquering parts of what was the Russian Empire, and eventually assembling it, most of it, into what became the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I mean, many people, especially in America, they don't even realize American troops participated in invasion of Russia, both in the occupation of the Arctic in the port city of Murmansk, but also in the Far East. The Americans and the Japanese, they landed in Vladivostok and then pushed towards Siberia, and they even forced pressure the warlord government of China in Beijing to send troops, some token troops to participate. But Japan sent the largest contingent in Far East. They had like about 70,000 troops on the ground. They occupied much of the Far East, all the way up to Lake Baikal.
There's some very interesting Japanese propaganda posters of gleeful Russians meeting the liberating Japanese forces with Japanese imperial flags in Vladivostok. Yeah, they're very interesting encapsulations of that entire experience in a single image.
I mean, yeah, I read an account where when the Red Army was pushing toward Vladivostok, there was a episode where the Reds, they wanted to they want to expel the Japanese, but they didn't have the heavy weapons. They didn't have artillery, so they approached the Chinese, because even though the Chinese were supposedly on the Allied side with Japan, but the two sides have no love for each other. So the Chinese commander let them on the down low loan them the Chinese artillery so they can bombard the Japanese position. There's a many interesting anecdote from that era. But then that the Soviet power now reached the Pacific, and they have an issue still with all the Russian concession in Manchuria, because Russia, even after Russo-Japanese War, they still control the northern half of the Manchuria. In fact, the city of Harbin, which is today the capital of Heilongjiang province, was built at that time because it sits on the junction of the railroad of the Trans-Siberian and the Trans-Manchurian. And if people go to Harbin, in the center of Harbin, there's a gigantic Orthodox church, Saint Sophia, and like there were hundreds of thousands of Russians living there. And during the Russian Civil War, a lot of white Russian refugees flood into Manchuria. So the white Russians that retained the control.
Yeah, they went to Harbin, but they also went as far as Shanghai. There was a big diaspora living there too. So they went to different places. It was really interesting.
Yes, and the white Russians that retained the control of the Trans-Manchurian Railway, with the support of the Allied power. So this is where the Soviet diplomacy, they said, you know what? We renounce all the unequal treaties with China, so China can have the railroad back. We renounce all the rights to the railroad. So in this way, the Soviet were finally able to finagle their way to get back into Manchuria. In the end, the railway ownership was divided to 50-50 between the 50% will be controlled by the Soviet, 50% will be controlled by the Japanese, and this would persist until 1931, the Mukden incident, when Japan launched a attack to occupy all of Manchuria, and that's when the border between Manchuria and Soviet Union became tense again, because Japan was a hostile power, and there was the whole border became militarized, because at that time there was a big debate between the Japanese army and the Japanese Navy. The Japanese Navy, they wanted to go south toward Southeast Asia, where they can grab all the oil fields in the European colonies, in the British and the Dutch colonies. And whereas the Japanese army, they want to go north. They want to go fight the Russians in Siberia. And so they did that in 1938.
And that didn't really lead much. And then there was the big one in Mongolia, right? In 1939, This was the the Battle of Palkingol, and they kept using the occupied Manchukuo/Manchuria, right? The initial one was to enter the Soviet Union, and this one was to enter Mongolia. And that battle was really devastating for Japan. I mean, they lost a lot of troops. In fact, one of the commanders for the Soviet side was the future Marshal of Victory, Zhukov. So he was obviously gaining experience there that he then took to the European theater in World War II. But this is where the Japanese lost their interest in fighting the Soviet Union and the United States at the same time. And I think it's also important, you talked about oil, right? The US was basically preventing Japan from having access to oil, and Japan was really needing that energy to power its expanding empire. And so, I mean, if you read some of the texts about what Japan was using, I mean, sometimes they were using horses, which is not unusual. You did also have that a little bit for Germany and the Soviet Union, but comparing that to American oil-powered jeeps, I mean, it was a big thing, right? For instance, like in the Philippines. So yeah, this was definitely something that they needed. So they decided to focus on the US and kind of leave the Soviet Union alone after they lost. I think it was like the percentage I saw was like 75% of their troops or something. It was a very significant amount. And obviously Mongolians participated in the battle too, so we want to give them credit for it. But yeah, it was an interesting experience. Mm-hmm.
So this gave the upper hand to the Japanese Navy in their debate against the Japanese Army. So this will lead to December 7th, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor and the Pacific War. And then another thing I do need to mention was after the full-scale war broke out between Japan and China in 1937, at that time, the Western powers, the European and the American, even though they have a lot of commercial interests in China, but they didn't want to get involved. You know, they don't want to get involved because they have bigger issues to deal with back in Europe with Hitler, rise of Hitler. So at that time, Chiang Kai-shek was hoping to bring in Western intervention to stop Japan. That's why he chose the battlefield in Shanghai. You know, that was one of the biggest battles that was fought in the second Sino-Japanese War, the Battle of Shanghai. The Chiang Kai-shek's idea is, okay, if we fight the war right in the center of Shanghai, in front of all the colonial powers, for sure they will come in and stop Japan. That did not happen, even though a American ship, American gunboat Panay was bombed in the Yangtze River by the Japanese. You know, the American just pretended that they didn't notice, like how they pretended that Israel didn't bomb USS Liberty. And so at that time, the only outside power that came to China's aid was Soviet Union, because, you know, the Soviet, they did also aware of the increasing alliance that was formed between Japan and Germany. They didn't want to face a two-front war. So it's also in Stalin's interest to support China in the fight against Japan. So Soviet Red Army pilots that flew directly,
specialists, pilots, military advisors, and I think they also helped with the building of a highway, from what I understand, to deliver goods from the USSR. So this was in the West. I think this was in Xinjiang,
yes.
I think so. Yeah, it was a pretty big undertaking considering the geopolitical circumstances.
Yeah, so the Soviet Red Army pilots, they would fly directly from Soviet Central Asia, make one stop in Central China, and they'll fly directly into the Battle of Shanghai. And this will bring to the, like, okay, we're moving rather quickly, but this will bring to the end of World War II, when
I think the one highlight here is the fact that Mao's son participated in the Red Army, which always, you know, blows my mind.
He was sent to Moscow to study, like many children of the communist leadership, and they were in Moscow at the time, and at the time of the Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi Germany invasion of the Soviet Union. So that was interesting. And then towards the end of World War II, in 1945, Japan was already being defeated everywhere else in the Pacific. So they decided to launch a big push in the continental East Asia, try to link up their controlled territory from Manchuria all the way to Vietnam. So instead of relying on marine transport, because most of their merchant marine has been sunk by American submarine by this time, so they decide to rely on rail link. So they did a major push called Operation Ichigo in 1944, try to link up all their occupied area from Manchuria to Vietnam. And this was one of the humiliating defeat for the Chinese, because this was toward the end of the World War II, and there was a huge collapse of the Chinese army. Japan took a huge chunk of territory, and they were able to accomplish their objective to link the railroad from Harbin to Hanoi to Vietnam. And at that time, that's when the Americans, they come to a realization they cannot rely on Chiang Kai-shek to defeat the Japanese on mainland Asia. Then they approach Stalin.
They've been negotiating Stalin's entry into the Asia Pacific theater for a while, and they agreed upon it in Yalta for when the big three met, and they sort of really ironed out their plans in Germany, right, in Potsdam in the summer of 1945. And so obviously by then the Red Army was free to enter that theater, and this is like a 1 million strong army, because they've now were successful and victorious in the European theater. So they were free to do this. And so this is one of the big questions as to whether the Americans, specifically President Truman, who made the decision to drop the 2 atomic bombs, whether that was necessary. And, in my opinion, it was unnecessary, because you already had that commitment from the Soviet Union, and they did enter Manchuria between the 2 bombings. So you knew that was going to collapse like a house of cards. So be that as it may, this is a separate question, but yeah, Stalin lived up to his promise, and he committed, it was like over 1 million people to Manchuria. And of course, Japan had some labor camps in that region. So reading about their liberation, and it had people from, not just the local Chinese and maybe some Russians, but also Americans and Europeans that were in these labor camps. Reading about the liberation was pretty interesting, but go ahead.
Yeah. So Stalin, for one of he did have some conditions for his participation in the entry against Japan, and in particular, this would lead to the Sino-Chinese Friendship Treaty that was signed in August 1945. This was the condition was China would recognize a formal independence of Mongolia, because Mongolia was part of the Qing Empire that broke away after the 1911 revolution. And then, and it changed hands several times. And finally, in 1920, the Soviet Red Army came in, helped the Mongolian communists to establish the People's Republic of Mongolia. But this was not recognized by the successful Chinese government. So Mongolia had de facto independence, but not de jure. So one of the Soviet conditions was the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek's government would recognize independence of Mongolia to allow holding a referendum in Mongolia to decide for Mongolian independence. So that was done. And the Soviet will restore their sphere of influence in Manchuria. So including the Soviet Navy will return to Port Arthur, and Soviet would have some kind of operational control of the Trans-Manchurian Railroad. And so this was also agreed to. And this would let during the August storm, more than 1 million Soviet Red Army pour across the border into Manchuria. They made very quick progress, demolished the Japanese the 750,000 man Kwandong army in a couple of weeks, and the Soviet Red Army pushed down to Korea. And this is when the American State Department folks start panicking. They're like, whoa, wait a minute. The rate of the progress, the Red Army is going to be in Japan before we arrive. So they came up a proposal to Stalin, said, okay, let's draw a line, 38th parallel across the Korean Peninsula. The Soviet Red Army would agree to stop north of 38th parallel, and you'll leave the southern half of the Korean peninsula for us, because it's going to take us a month, a few weeks to get our ship there to take the Japanese surrender. So this would Stalin agreed to that deal. This basically led to the division of Korea.
Stalin agreed to a lot of deals. It was the Soviet Red Army that conquered Berlin, lost a ton of people, and then it just invited the Brits and the Americans and the French for that quadripartite initial division of Berlin. And then, of course, it was split into the two spheres, popularly thought to be done by the Soviets, but it was actually done more so by the Americans. Yeah, so I think if you actually look at Stalin's foreign policy, it was very agreeable in this time when it came to, I guess, powers that he considered to be at his level, and obviously in this particular context. I have a question for you. Go ahead.
Okay, go keep that question in mind. But to be fair to Stalin, at that time, America was looking to be quite unstoppable, because at the end of World War II, Soviet Union was devastated. So Europe was devastated. United States was 50% of the world's GDP. They had the 50% of the world's manufacturing, because their homeland, US, was untouched by war. And right after World War II, Stalin realized Soviet Union needs time to recover. He was not interested to go into a new conflict. Unlike, say, General Patton. General Patton famously said, "Oh, we fought the wrong enemy. We fought on the wrong side."
Oh, he's made lots of really fun statements about the Russians, and of course, when he said the Russians, he meant all the entire Red Army, which was multi-ethnic, calling them drunks and, basically almost like subhumans. So he's known for his mildly racist, to put it mildly.
Go ahead with your question.
Well, I actually wanted to comment on the Stalin issue as well. I think that particular period is the birth of the false trope that the Soviet Union wanted to conquer the world, because, as you pointed out, the Soviet Union was completely devastated, right? The official death toll is 27 million, which is partly military, so that's about 9 million. The rest were civilians. Obviously, that entire European part of Russia and, modern day Ukraine, Belarus, etc., was devastated through warfare. You could still go into any random forest and you can find relics from that period, 80 years later. You can find maybe a skull, you can find, helmets, etc. And you can find mines. The earth still gives you sort of even though it's been so many decades, the earth sort of breathes that conflict still. And then they kind of wonder, why do the Russians celebrate Victory Day? But anyway, Stalin's goal was to push the border as far out to protect the Soviet Union as possible. Russia, in its various forms, had been invaded through the Polish corridor twice, right through Napoleon with Hitler. And so this is why Stalin went, into places like Poland. It wasn't like, I'm going to conquer the entire world. It was to make, basically to create a very big security border. But I think it's important to point that out.